Welcome to Vstudio. I am joined today by a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyways. John Bostock is here with us. John is a former executive at General Electric, GE, as well as Big Ass Fans, and is currently an operating partner at Gridiron Capital. John is also a published author of a best-selling book called The Elephant's Dilemma and a frequent contributor to Forbes Executive Council. And I am really excited to talk with you, John, because you published an article that I think is just completely important for the times we're in now to unpack a little bit. So, John, thanks for being here with us.
Yeah, Alex, it's awesome to talk through it. I love working with Forbes because it really gives me the chance to think about what's happening in today's world and translate it to business. And I think you're right. This last article that I wrote is kind of an interesting look at what we need to think about in 2022.
Well, John, what I love about it, one is you have a very unique perspective. You worked in a lot of different business units at GE. You're obviously in the heart of manufacturing and distribution with Big Ass Fans. So I think you've got a unique point of view, but also this article was not written, I think, from a traditional viewpoint of supply chain, which is distribution, logistics, material shortages. It was really more from a customer experience lens, and that's not something I've seen a lot of commentary on. So, first of all, what was the inspiration for the topic?
Yeah, it's never easy, and I think if you look at the supply chain, it's so obvious that there are issues. Whether you go to a grocery store and you see empty shelves, or you order something online and it takes 3 weeks longer, I think we've become accustomed to that. And so we're used to what we are now understanding to be supply chain issues. At the same time, I think we're reading articles about inflation and all of the challenges that we face. And so it really got me thinking, well, what's going to happen, right? What is the cause and effect of this? And to me, it's very, very simple. When you look at it from a customer standpoint, you're going to disappoint your customers. And so for us, as we think about how we prepare for it, we shouldn't worry about things that we can't control. So if containers are going to take a little bit of time, there's really nothing we can do to speed that up. And if the price of commodities increases, we're going to have to pay those increases just like everyone else. But the one thing we can do is to make sure our customers are prepared for it. And, as I sat down to write the article, I really started thinking not enough companies are prepared for the outcome. Everyone is thinking about how they're going to deal with the delayed container or how they're going to deal with the increasing prices of commodities. Not a lot of companies, sadly, are thinking about how to get ahead of losing customers. And then more importantly, if you do lose customers, how are you going to win them back?
Well, I love the line there of you're going to disappoint your customers, and I think that's a tough pill to swallow, but a harsh reality that everybody has to deal with, because you're right, supply chains in every way are turned upside down, and there's really no escaping it. Where would you advise a company even begin when you sit down? And I guess if you have different stages of grief, acceptance is the first one. After you've reached acceptance and you say, okay, we're going to have some issues, how do you start looking at strategies? I mean, where do you even begin? Because this is such brand new territory for so many companies.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of it comes down to how relevant time is to your customers. And so if they need a product and they need it that day, the likelihood is if you're out of stock, they're going to go somewhere else. And so the first thing you've really got to understand is, how does time impact your customer's world? And if they need something that day and you don't have it, that means that you've got to prepare that they're going to go somewhere else. Once they go somewhere else, how are you going to win them back? And frankly, that's not something you can compete with. And so, Alex, I think you really have to take a step back and understand the realities of what's going to occur. Because if you just say that you can tell them, look, it's going to come back in 2 weeks, come back then, and we'll be able to deliver on it, it's not going to work. So the first thing is really assessing your risk as it relates to time and truly building a strategy based on the realities of that. And this is why I felt so strongly about the article, is that inevitably, if the customer needs it on a Tuesday and you don't have it on that Tuesday, you're going to lose them. And so therefore, you've got to start thinking about how to win them back. And to me, it's a very simple equation.
Yeah. Before we go into the win back strategies, what I love about that is you do need to evaluate, is it a mission critical item or service that I'm supplying? How is that going to impact the customer? There's probably communication strategies around that. But something interesting that I came across recently is customers recommending, go talk to a sister branch or a sister company or even a competitor. I mean, what are your thoughts on once I recognize that I'm going to fall short of what they need, proactively helping them find an alternative, even if I'm not making any money directly on that transaction? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's funny. And I mentioned a little bit of that in the article. I talked about the cream cheese incident of late 2021 when
Yeah,
you
elaborate
think
on
about
that,
the
please.
cheesecake dilemma. How are you going to do it with a shortage of cream cheese? And so, clearly it's something that you have to think about. I think for really good companies, they think about building a long-term relationship with their customers, and they think about lifetime value not only being a quantitative measure, but being something that is associated with a lifetime relationship. And so I think you've got to really be smart about how you help customers out. The example that I pointed to with if they need the product on a Tuesday and you don't have it on a Tuesday, I absolutely think you should be prepared to help them solve their needs, because this is about long-term relationship and long-term value. And again, once we break out of the economic expectations of what a customer means and we think about solving problems for them and really making sure we're there for them when they need it, it's a perfect example to say you should absolutely help them find the product. You should absolutely help them solve what it is they need to solve for. It's effectively like airlines, right? If you're on a flight that doesn't happen, the airlines work hopefully with partner airlines to get you from point A to Z. And a lot of times we read horror stories, but for the most part, they're trying to help you get to where you're going. So I think every type of business should really think about it in that way. You're trying to solve for something that achieves some outcome for the customer.
I love that. You're working towards an outcome, not necessarily a sale. And you really kind of twisted the knife on me there with an airline story, because just last week I got rebooked with no notification from the airline. And so I missed the flight that they rebooked me on, which was terrible because the whole day would have been so much better had there just been communication. So before we get to the win back, which I promise we're going to talk about, talk a little bit about communication. When it's not a situation of I need it on a Tuesday, it's not going to be there, and it's just things have changed, lead times, expectations. How can customers think about, or actually, how can vendors think better about transparency around where things are, how they're moving through their supply chain, what delivery might look like? Because typically, in a world of 3 to 5 day delivery that maybe is now 3 to 5 weeks, 3 to 5 months, whatever, they're having to rethink what that customer engagement looks like between sale and delivery. So maybe touch on that for a moment.
Yeah, it's funny. I think on average, people don't think of our world as being a global supply chain. And I bring that up because I remember on one of my first visits to Asia, landing and seeing a bunch of containers getting ready to be loaded onto a ship. And being the business geek I am, I thought, wow, this is so cool. This is a visual interpretation of the global supply chain. These containers are being loaded, and then they're going to be on the sea for a while, and they're going to end up in a port in Los Angeles or some other location like that. And then ultimately they end up on the retail shelf and to your home. And so I was just so excited to see like the end-to-end process visually with my own eyes. Why I bring that up is because people don't really have the context of global supply chain, and they don't really understand the price metrics associated with that. And so when you think about communication, ultimately it comes down to giving people context and clarity around what is happening. So when you walk into a store and you expect a product to be on the shelf on a Tuesday, you don't really understand why it isn't there. And your first instinct is to assume that the store did something wrong. Or if you walk into that store and the product happens to be there, but it's double the price of what it was 2 weeks earlier, you assume that the store did something wrong. You don't think about it as though the container is now 3 times more expensive, or the components within that product are more expensive. And so ultimately, as brands and as companies, what we need to do is provide context and clarity so that our customers are prepared for what is happening, whether it's a price increase, whether it's products that are not available, whether it's delays. I think we as brands and businesses owe it to our customers to give them the real information and to give them the math and give them the timeline to understand why we're making decisions in the way we are, so that when we disappoint them, which again, the headline is we're going to disappoint customers in 2022. When we do that, at least they understand why it happened. And we were open and honest and upfront with them about the process. And I think, look, going back to your airline example, you wouldn't be as upset if you had the context and the clarity as to why it happened. But most likely you showed up at the airport, you realized there was a change with no context, with no clarity, and you were frustrated. And so when we have information, the human brain processes it, we're much more happy about the situation and we can deal with it. And I think that's also part of our job, is getting people ready.
Yeah, it's so simple, but it's just not been part of our daily routine, and I think companies are having to adjust to new expectations. I mean, I'm sure you've received from suppliers the price increase letters where there's a ton of color around why the price is increasing, what they're trying to do to prevent further increases, and that actually goes a long way, even though it's a very simple thing to put together. So I think this is going to become a very normal part of business, whether it's B2B or B2C, is just pulling people into the fold of what's actually happening to prices, lead times, delivery terms, all of that stuff. As you keep pointing out, though, you're going to disappoint customers. And sometimes that's going to lead to a breakup. So what do you do in that situation when you communicate it, you've done all the right things, and customer still has to go somewhere else because, like we said, it's either a critical component or they're just, I'm going to shop around, I'm going to go find something else. What's your next move as a company?
Yeah. And what's interesting about it is you introduced one of the great concepts through a question. And that concept was helping the customer achieve the outcome. And I think that doing that is great. I think making it best in class is then following up to make sure that it did meet their expectations as if you sold it yourself. And again, very counterintuitive. But as you think about solving for customer issues, you want to treat them, whether they buy the product from you or whether they solved it through a recommendation, you want to treat them as though they were your customer, because it's about that long-term value and the long-term relationship. So one of the very tactical things I'd recommend that is rooted in your suggestion, which if you disappoint them, help them achieve the outcome and then follow up as if you delivered on that outcome and make sure that they've got everything they need. That's one part. I think more structurally, what I'd recommend is making sure that you have a great platform in place that allows you to manage your customers and communicate with your customers so that you really understand that A, you've given them the context and clarity around the situation, and that you can then touch base with them moving forward to make sure that if they do have any challenges, any needs, you're there for them. So I think figuring out how to best insert yourself into the process of customer communication will help dramatically. And as I said, I think whether you're solving it or not, treat them like you're the customer or they're the customer and that you solved it for them.
That reminded me of the Office, where Michael tries to win back customers with gift baskets, and all
Yeah.
they really want is to be able to order product more easily online or have better pricing.
I mean, Alex, the other reality of winning back customers is we can't be lazy. And here's what I mean. When we lose customers, when a customer goes somewhere else, most likely they're going to either be introduced to a new brand, a new service, a new distribution model. Something will change. Something will be new about it. In your example, if you were put on a different airline, you're going to experience something you may not have experienced before. So what you can't forget is that, number one, as I keep beating the drum on, you got to maintain that relationship. But number two, you may have to sell back to them in a different way than you sold to initially because of their exposure to something else, because they've found some new variable. And so we can't just assume that by giving context, giving clarity, having a customer that's always been there, solving it for them, they're just going to come back in the way that they were operating before they left the first time. We have to be ready to sell based on the outcome of what may have happened. So using the Goofy cheesecake example, if everyone went out and made apple pie and they fell in love with apple pie, well, we not only need to have our product available to them when they want to make cheesecake, but we may need to remind them why they loved it in the first place. And look, I know it's a goofy example because it provides the clarity and context around what I mean. But the bottom line is we're going to have to sell again. And to win them back, they're just not going to come back in the way that they were before.
Well, the reality is we live in a hyper competitive and increasingly global market, and communication can go a long way. But if you're not cutting it from a product or service standpoint, then you are going to lose customers. You're going to have a leaky bucket. So I think that's a really good reminder that, supply chain woes may be temporary, but this commitment to having a better product or service or differentiated is something that has to stay with the brand. So if you do go on another airline and you have a better experience with that airline than your past flights, it's not an issue that they had to transfer you over because this flight got canceled. It's an issue that there's an airline outperforming you. So supply chains also can't be an excuse for businesses to lose business, to lose customers. So I really like bringing it back to center on that. We've had what feels like decades worth of change in the past 2 to 3 years alone in supply chain. Maybe things are going to start to come back to normal sometime this year. We'll see. But what is your prediction? It can be a bold prediction, or it can be just what I think is going to happen over the next 5-10 years, call it, in terms of supply chains globally, locally. I mean, where are things going? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think it's multifaceted, and I think it's a significant challenge. I think consumption overall has to decrease. I think if we look at the rate of consumption and just start with consumers, and ultimately that leads to business production, I think it has to decrease. The economy is really complex. Supply chains are really long, and we're seeing that. So we started moving really fast. You look at the last 2 decades as an example, from a raw material perspective, like most of the plastic in the world only came in to the environment in the last 20 years. So it kind of puts it into perspective about how rapidly the market has grown and expanded. And so consumption, I think, is going to have to slow down. And then when you start thinking about consumption slowing down, you have to think about how that impacts supply chains throughout. I think that with production and demand slowing down, effectively you're going to have to get closer to the consumer. So I would bet on onshoring of certain business categories. I think that when you think about global supply chains, and I mentioned that story about showing up in Asia and seeing those containers overseas, I think we're going to see less of those coming to the US. I think US manufacturing is going to become more front and center, not for any other reason other than it's more small batch, more in the hands, faster to consumers than not. And so I think there will be a little bit of a reset on that. I also think that things are cyclical, and I think that we're going to move to an environment of stay at home and work remote, and then I think we're going to snap back to work in an office. And so in terms of consumption, you'll see shifts. So overall consumption comes down, but then you'll see increased demand of automobiles because people will be driving more, gasoline because people will be going from point A to point B, with B being work. You'll see more apparel change and the
Restaurants.
trends. So it's all the way back to where we
right.
were before. And so, I think that businesses just have to be prepared for that and really go all in on this assumption that the mass market behavior that we've come to know is going to change. Companies are going to have to be more mindful about how they produce at mass and how they deal with the supply chain. And I do think that there'll be an overcorrection towards U.S. manufacturing, slowing down goods coming from overseas, et cetera. So I think it's going to be a pretty massive transformative period. And I think the best example is to always remind ourselves that I think we can visualize those mounds of plastic everywhere, and it's a bad thing, right, from the environment perspective. But what I love about that point is that's really only the last 20 years. So imagine 20 years forward, the rapid amount of change in the other direction. And that's when you can start imagining how things will change, not only from a supply chain sustainability standpoint, but really the way that we imagine creating products and then selling those products. And frankly, it's going to impact services as well, as I suggested.
Well, there's so many threads in that conversation that we could pull on, and I just think the supply chain is so complicated, and it's everything we touch, experience in our daily lives. So, appreciate the great insights here, and would love to have you back on, have additional conversations as things change over the next year, 5 years. Definitely going to be a lot of back and forth. Like you said, it's all cyclical and it's all tied. So as one thing shifts, another comes on board, and yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun to see what happens next. So John, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your perspective, and for continuing to put out great content on Forbes.
Enjoyed it, Alex. Talk soon.
All right. Thank you.